Good morning, everybody from Brussels. I hope you're all well, despite these very complicated pandemic times. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar entitled Pulling the Thread on the Fashion Industry. We're numerous participants today, which is fantastic, from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today, our webinar is going to discuss the sustainability of the fashion industry and explore the upcoming EU policy agenda and other measures in the sector that we can expect, such as the extended producer responsibility, and lots of other interesting insights that we will be getting from our extremely distinguished panel of guests that we have lined up for you today. So if I may just please ask you to turn your video cameras off. In any case, you are on mute, which means that all the questions will need to go into the chat box, into the Q&A. So within a few minutes, once everybody has had the opportunity to join, I'll be introducing our panel and kicking off. So while we get settled, please also take note of the fact that this webinar will be recorded and it will be made available to you afterwards in case you have to dip in and out or want to consult some of the presentations again later. As we go along, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, as I said, so that we can process those to the extent possible. Whenever we don't have time to get to your questions, because it is, after all, only a 75-minute webinar, I think we have intended to collect all the questions, compile some answers for you, and make them available again later on, along with the video. So now I think that almost everybody has had the opportunity to join, and there might be a few more joining later, but it will be a great pleasure now for me to kick off and introduce our panel. May I remind you to please turn off your video cameras so that we can focus only on the panel who are going to be presenting. And if you have any questions, please make sure they go in the chat. So today we're doing something a little bit different. For the first time, ADS Insight, which is my company, is partnering with Eunomia Research and Consulting to host this webinar for you, featuring a panel of 4 advisors, all of whom have a slightly different take, slightly different view on the issue of textile sustainability. And we're very, very pleased to have you all here listening to us. Our first speaker will be Nusa Urbančič. Nusa is a campaign director at the Changing Markets Foundation, having a great expertise in market-focused campaigns, driving change towards a more sustainable economy. Nusa will be laying out all sorts of different sustainability challenges, and her organization in particular is geared towards supporting NGOs to accelerate environmental and social progress. So Nusa will come on in a minute. After Nusa, we will have the chance to listen to Tina Ajdič. Tina is a colleague of mine at ADS Insight, and she will be presenting the upcoming EU strategy for textiles and other EU measures. She's senior advisor on circular economy policy at ADS Insight and has a great expertise in policy processes in the EU, and of course very much on keeping an eye also on the SDGs at a global level. After Tina, we'll have the opportunity to listen to Joe Papineschi, our partner from Eunomia Research and Consulting. He's a chairperson of Eunomia and having deep expertise overall on circular economy matters. He will be presenting the extended producer responsibility as a way to drive sustainability in the fashion world. And finally, we will have Tara Luckman, co-founder of Flourish Csr, a consultancy leading the way with responsible business specialists and providing an industry perspective here today on addressing the sustainability of the textiles and apparel sector. Tara has a background in textile science and has also had environmental and sustainability roles at ASOS and Tesco. So it will be wonderful to hear what the industry's perspective can and should be at this time when we are really looking to revise and review how we deal with the textiles, apparel and fashion sector. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Nusa. I'm your moderator. My name is Aida Bakri. I'm a managing director here at ADS Insight. And Nusa, the floor is yours for 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, great. So I think Aida already did a great presentation of who I am and who Changing Markets is. So I would just dive right into the problem with fast fashion. So since early 2000, the fashion production has more than doubled, and average consumer buys now 60% more clothes and wears them for half as long as 15 years ago. So we see that some garments are now discarded just after 7 or 8 uses. And this is kind of causing mountains of waste and other environmental issues. So yeah, Aida, okay? I just saw that you requested.
I put up your screen now. Can everybody see your screen? Can everybody see? Tara, can you give me a thumbs up, please, if you can see? Yeah, you can see the presentation. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, you were flipped, Nusa. We could see your picture, but not your presentation.
Okay, great.
Back to you.
Now everyone can see. Yeah. So this slide, I think, illustrates very well what the problem is with the runaway consumption of fast fashion. And I think most participants on this webinar would already be aware of this. What we're probably less aware is that this runaway consumption of fast fashion is enabled by fibers. So this graph, I think, is very telling because you can see that most of the natural fibers that are on the bottom of this graph, their production has remained stable. But in 2000, polyester overtook cotton. And since then, its production has more than doubled. And this currently synthetic fibers represent 69% of all the textile consumption. And this is going to increase to 73% by 2030. So we see that this is a huge problem. Synthetic fibers are causing huge pressure on the waste management system. They're shedding microfibers, and also they're produced from fossil fuels, oil and gas. And this is kind of what most of the industry is away from. So I read a little bit like the impacts that can happen in different parts of supply chain of the fashion industry. So this graph tries to illustrate that, and this is problematic with every fiber. So we have issues from raw material sourcing to end of life. Raw material sourcing, for example, if you look at cotton, there's high use of pesticides. If you look at viscose, it can lead to deforestation. Synthetic fibers are produced by extraction of oil and gas, increasingly fracking, and some Chinese companies are investing into coal as well. Capturing toxic chemicals can be released. This can have negative health impacts on people, but also on ecosystems. It can destroy livelihoods of communities living around those factories. Wet processing has similar issues, like enormous amount of toxic chemicals is used in this part of supply chain. Some of them have been banned by the EU, but they're still being used in countries like Indonesia, where this is happening. Especially dyeing is a big problem. Sometimes rivers in Indonesia turn to whatever the color of the current collection is. And people are hugely affected by this part of the supply chain. Garment manufacturing, this is so-called tier 1, which is what fashion industry tend to be a little bit more transparent about this part of supply chain because of the Rana Plaza disaster. But we see significant labor rights violations. 93% of workers still don't earn living wage. Before the pandemic, this has now deteriorated, and a lot of workers are now facing poverty and hunger. And yeah, this is something where brands actually have huge influence because they're main buyers, and they could address this. When clothes move to shops and towards the consumer, the impacts don't end here, because a lot of clothes shed microfibers. One study said 50 billion plastic bottle equivalent of microfibers are released into the environment through washing and use of clothes. And a recent study showed when they were studying microfibers in the Arctic, over 70% are similar to polyester that is in our clothes. So we probably still don't understand the extent of this problem and the health implications it might have. At the end of life, we kind of see still the microfiber problem, but also because we have more and more waste, it's really difficult to manage. 87% of clothes end up in landfills, environment, or they're incinerated. Because the quality is becoming lower, the levels of incineration are increasing, and less than 1% of clothes is actually recycled back into clothes. We had a campaign on viscose, so I want to just give case studies because I don't have time to go into each and individual fiber. Viscose is produced from wood pulp, so it's one of the kind of natural, although it's man-made, because it needs toxic chemicals to kind of be transformed into fiber. It currently presents around 5% of all fibers used because of the high growth of synthetics, and most of it ends up in clothing. It's mostly produced in China, India, Indonesia, although there's also a big factory in Europe, or actually a couple of factories are still in Europe. And there are several problems that can occur in the supply chain. It can lead to deforestation. Several producers are actually sourcing from ancient and endangered forests, leading to CO2 emissions, human rights violations, etc. Our campaign focused on exposing pollution from fiber manufacturing. So the chemical released is called carbon disulfide, amongst other chemicals, but this one has particularly bad impacts on people. It cannot be eliminated from viscose production, but it can be managed in a closed loop system. You can have lyocell production, which doesn't use this kind of chemical, but because it's not a replacement for viscose, like a lot of industry was using this viscose coming from polluting factories. This is how it looked like, pollution from viscose. I think when we started working on this, we hit two big problems. One was the lack of transparency, and the other one was lack of legislation that would address this, because most of production of fibers happens in countries that have lax environmental and social standards. And we did eventually find that EU has best available technology standard that is now being adopted after our campaign as the standard in the industry. So over 50% of production of producers that are producing over half of viscose have now already signed up voluntarily to this standard. And a lot of fashion brands are working with them to kind of move into the better direction. But I was mentioning lack of legislation was a big problem. And this, what we're doing and what the brands are doing right now is they're kind of committing voluntarily to improve this. But we also studied voluntary commitments in the fashion industry that are many, many. Just yesterday, I was checking eco-label index, and there are 20 eco-labels just on the fashion industry. There are also a lot of other initiatives that are not labels as such, but they are intended to address environmental or social impacts of the industry. We analyzed some of them in 2018, some of them no longer exist right now, and others still have some issues that they promised to address. For example, HIG Index promised full transparency by 2020. We don't believe this has happened. Let's say, scores of production at facilities, it's still entirely up to brands and producers if they want to publish that or not. Another problem with standards is also that they have several different modules. They very rarely cover the entire supply chain and the impacts throughout the supply chain, but they're being used a little bit indiscriminately. So kind of companies would say to us when we worked on polluting viscose manufacturing, that they actually address this issue because they're working with Canopy to address deforestation. So there is this lack of comprehensive approach when it comes to voluntary initiatives. Voluntary commitments also very often, they give brands like really good headlines when they make them. They get, you know, great media, everyone's reporting about it, but then very little verification happens further on whether or not this commitment has been implemented. So you see this very simple kind of graph, words versus action. We've also kind of seen that often the industry uses voluntary commitments to delay or derail legislation. Like they are committed, but when legislation comes, they kind of try to lobby against it. And we're really hoping that this will not happen on the EU textile strategy, because the COVID-19 pandemic revealed real cracks in the system. It revealed that we really need legislation. As I mentioned before, 93% of workers were not getting living wage even before the pandemic. And right now, the fashion brands, just in the first 6 months of the pandemic, they owed the producers $16 billion just for orders that were already placed or delivered. And some of them are still refusing to pay, or they're using this pandemic to kind of negotiate the prices further down, which has really big issues with labor and environmental standards as well, because if the margins are so low, companies where this production is outsourced, they cannot invest into better environmental and social standards. And this is why we need legislation. We think that the EU textile strategy is a great opportunity. I was talking mostly about fashion industry, which represents around 60 or 70% of the textile production. But EU is the biggest, one of the biggest textile markets. I think it's the biggest importer of textiles in the world. And with great power comes great responsibility. So EU can make a real difference here. I think some of the things that it should do, like we have seen that the rate of consumption, the growth of consumption, and the sheer volume of low quality disposable clothes is inherently unsustainable. So this cannot continue in such a way. The dependence on fossil fuels also is a big no-go in the world that is trying to decarbonize. So one of the key things that we think the Commission should do is like slow down the fashion industry, makes fashion brands responsible for what happens at the end of life, ensure that the products that are being put on the market are actually reusable, repairable, recyclables with eco-design measures, modulated fees or something like that. And also make sure that investment actually happens into recycling fiber to fiber, and not just, right now all the recycled clothes on the market are mostly from recycled polyester coming from plastic bottles. And we think this is not sustainable, and this is not where the industry should be moving to. Another key aspect is due diligence and transparency. I was mentioning before, we cannot have accountability if we don't know who's producing for these brands. And very often, even the workers don't know who they're producing for, even though now companies have committed to become more transparent, and some of them are publishing tier 1 producers. Finally, I think a great opportunity is to regulate green claims, because a lot of the claims that we have are unsubstantiated. A lot of the certification schemes are not fit for purpose, and they're creating this illusion that the industry is more sustainable than it really is. I think we can have a better fashion industry, but we really think legislation is the way forward. Thank you very much. Over to you. And I try to stop screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Nusa. That was a very interesting way to kick off our debate today. And I think that you've really touched on all the really important topics that we're facing here with the sustainability challenges around the textiles and apparel sector. You mentioned many times the issue of lack of transparency, lack of policy, and of course we are here today specifically because We know that the EU has great plans in its pocket for regulating textiles in a circular way. We've seen it before with plastics, and now it's really the textile sector that's in the spotlight. You did receive a couple of questions, Nusa, to your presentation. One was, is sourcing ethical dyes easy to do? And I would like to ask you if you could please type the reply into the chat so that we can proceed. And there was another very interesting question about the viscose supply chain, and I can see that there's some activity going on in the chat, including some other resources that are available. So thank you for that, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. I think it set the scene very nicely, and it also provides a great bridge over to Tina's presentation. For those of you who have just joined us, I'd like just to remind you that we have 4 very distinguished advisors on our panel today. We've got Nusa, who just spoke on environmental and social challenges. Her organization supports NGOs in their campaigns. Tina Ajdič, who's up next, will be talking on EU circular economy policy. After that, we have Joe Papineschi from Eunomia, our partners for this webinar, and Joe will be speaking about extended producer responsibility, which is also something that Nusa, you just touched on. Finally, we'll have Tara on the industry challenges and providing a very nice industry perspective, helping us maybe to guide organizations into more sustainable choices. So Tina, the floor is yours for 12 minutes.
Thank you, Ida. I'll just share my screen here. So thank you, and hi everyone. My name is Tina Ajdič, and I work as Senior Advisor on EU Circular Economy Policy. My job is to help clients from the private sector, NGOs and associations get involved in the EU legislative process and get your voices heard. So today I have the pleasure to give you an overview of some of the key upcoming EU measures on textiles, which will have a significant impact on the fashion industry. But first, a little introduction to how the EU legislation is adopted for those who might not be too familiar with the EU legislative process. We have 3 key EU institutions involved in this process. First, the European Commission, which is the EU executive branch that drafts and puts forward a legislative proposal, which then goes to the European Parliament, representing the EU citizens, and the Council of the EU, representing the 27 EU member states, who have to then adopt their positions on the Commission's proposal and have to negotiate and agree on the final text, which then becomes EU law that member states need to comply with. So as you might know, circular economy has become a priority for the EU for the past 5 to 6 years. And what does the EU really mean by a circular economy? So contrary to a current linear economic model, which is all about take, make, and waste, circular economy focuses on waste prevention and reduction, reuse, and recycling. So trying to keep the value of materials and products for as long as possible and minimizing resource use and waste. Now, the European Commission has put forward several measures to drive the circular economy. And most recently, last March, the Commission published a new Circular Economy Action Plan, which basically outlines actions and measures the European Commission will take in order to move towards a circular economy. And in the action plan, some key sectors are identified, among which also textiles. The action plan identifies some of the key challenges with textiles, as already mentioned by Nusa, being very resource intensive, and the 4th highest pressure category for the use of primary raw materials and water, and 5th for greenhouse gas emissions. and less than 1% of all textiles worldwide is currently recycled into new textiles, meaning that the majority of textile waste is being landfill or incinerated or ends up in our environment. So in order to address these challenges, the Commission proposes in the action plan a few key measures in order to improve the circularity of textiles. First is a comprehensive EU strategy for textiles, which is expected to be put forward in the third quarter of this year. And the strategy will outline measures, legislative and other measures that the Commission will take in order to drive a more circular textile sector. Second is the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is expected to be put forward by the Commission as a legislative proposal towards the end of the year. And the purpose is to make products more sustainable, to make sustainable products the new norm in the EU, and to improve design for products to be longer lasting, reusable, and recyclable. Now, another measure is the chemical strategy for sustainability, which applies, of course, to textiles. And the aim of the strategy is try to reduce toxic and hazardous chemicals. And last but not least, the Commission is also looking into different measures in order to address the microplastics problem, which also, of course, affects textiles, in particular as synthetic fibers, when washed, leak microplastics and causing microplastic pollution. Now, if we look more specifically into the upcoming EU strategy for textiles and what it aims to do, the overall goal is to help the EU shift to a more climate neutral and circular economy, where products are designed to be more durable, reusable, repairable, recyclable, and energy efficient. More specifically, the strategy will aim to strengthen the industrial competitiveness and innovation, boost the EU market for sustainable and circular textiles, including the market for textile reuse, address fast fashion, and drive new business models. Now, here are some of the measures that the Commission is currently considering to be put into the textile strategy. This is still up for discussion, but here are some of the measures that were already identified by the Commission in its roadmap that was published earlier this month. And these include targets to step up reuse and recycling, designed for sustainability to increase the uptake of secondary raw materials and reduce the presence of hazardous chemicals. Also, actions to promote more sustainable production processes. The Commission will also consider the role of extended producer responsibility in promoting sustainable textiles and treatment of textile waste, in line with the EU waste hierarchy, which, as you might know, prioritizes prevention followed by reuse and recycling. The Commission will also look into incentivizing product as a service and other sustainable business models, and plans to also come forward with a guidance on separate collection of textile waste. As you might know, this is already an existing obligation set in the EU legislation, requiring member states to set up separate collection of textile waste by 2025. Another measure to be considered is green public procurement, and also reinforcing human rights protection and due diligence across the value chains, improving traceability and transparency, and steering international cooperation towards more sustainable production and consumption patterns. In terms of next steps, 2025 will be a key year because this is when member states will have to have in place separate collection for textile waste. But the momentum is now, and the EU textile strategy is being prepared as we speak. So it is very important for you, for all interested stakeholders, to get involved in this process and help shape the strategy and the related upcoming legislative measures. Now, of course, if you need more information on how to get involved or how to get in touch with the EU, feel free to contact me. Our contact details are at the end of my presentation. But here are just a few actions that are open right now for you. And one is the consultation on the Commission's roadmap, which identifies the scale of the problem and also puts forward some of the measures to be considered in the textile strategy. You can provide your feedback on this roadmap until the 2nd of February. Following that, there will be a public consultation, probably in mid-February or March, and will run for 12 weeks. And this will be a more detailed online survey asking you about different measures and your positions about how the EU should move forward towards more circular textiles. There will also be likely workshops and conferences to contribute to this process. And also, you can set up also individual meetings with relevant EU policymakers in charge of developing the strategy. So the strategy is expected in the 3rd quarter of this year, probably after the summer, around September. And it will announce different legislative and other measures, such as, for example, on eco-design, reuse and recycling targets, EPR, and other. Now, in terms of the timeline, normally it takes a few years for the EU to adopt legislation or revise legislation. But we have seen, for example, in the case of plastics, that legislation can get adopted also in record time of just 1 year. So that is just to say that change is coming and is coming soon. So it's very important to stay closely involved in the process and help shape the upcoming EU measures. Here are my contact details in case you need more information, and of course, happy to answer your questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that very comprehensive overview of what's to be expected in the coming weeks, months, and certainly for the years until 2025. You have had a couple of questions in the chat, and one in particular relates to what specific measures are going to be coming forward to reduce the pollution of microplastics from washing textiles, and when will they be implemented? Tina, I would encourage you to please type the reply in the chat if you can, so that we can stick to the timetable. I'm just checking, will the EU accept comments from the UK after Brexit? Another very good question. If you could please reply to that one. Best of luck, Tina. Speculating on anything to do with Brexit, but indeed, I think the answer is very clear on that one, and it would be good if you could please reply. Without delaying us any further, Tina, I would just like to quickly sum up the EU's intention to try to address the textiles issue from various angles. And I think that what we're trying to do here is really to present a way for everybody to feel that they can be involved in this process and be heard, and certainly the intention is to raise the standard, and any actors wishing to delay the process, any actors wishing to find other ways to do things are of course invited to explain why they feel that way. And I think that the dialogue is open. In particular, no clear concrete measures are known at this moment, Tina, as you said. So it's really early days for the textile strategy, and therefore a really, really good time to get involved. Consumption of garments is expected to double by 2030. So I would like to invite Joe now to give us an introduction to how producers can take responsibility, and in particular, what other measures, Joe, you and your wonderful company Eunomia have in mind for how to address these textiles and garment challenges in the coming years. Joe Papineschi, the floor is yours for 12 minutes.
Many thanks. And yeah, good morning, everybody. Eunomia is one of the European Commission's main advisors on circular economy. And so we've been heavily involved in things like the plastic strategy and development of the Single-Use Plastics Directive and its implementation over recent years. But we also work very closely with companies on their adaptation to both increasing regulatory pressure and demand for consumers for more sustainable products. What I'm going to talk about briefly today is a little bit more about the end-of-life situation with textiles at the moment, and particularly focusing on the potential role of EPR within the implementation of the textile strategy. You've seen these charts already, but what they really illustrate is a broken business model from a circular economy point of view. So we're seeing this very rapid growth in consumption of clothing and textiles, but at the same time, and unsurprisingly, I guess, a steady reduction in the number of times that an item of clothing is used before it's discarded. And that picture is driving this growth very rapid growth in consumption of fibers, both synthetic and man-made. Natural and the man-made cellulosic fibers that were mentioned earlier. They're still a relatively small part of the picture, but growing relatively strongly as well. And all of this is in the context, obviously, of increased consumer concern about global warming, exemplified just yesterday with the publication of the UNEP research on public attitude, showing that globally something like 2/3 of people consider the climate change to be an emergency that requires significant immediate action, with that number increasing up to over 80% in many high-income economies. That research was a little bit weighted towards younger people, but obviously those are the consumers of tomorrow, or often today when it comes to fashion, and certainly major opinion formers on this topic that are driving what we're seeing at the moment as being a very ambitious commission that's intending to go further than even the last commission did with things like the plastic strategy. And this is being partly driven by those upstream impacts of production. And it feels like one of the really key take-home messages really is that we're not going to recycle our way out of this situation, because the savings we make, for instance, on carbon emissions from recycling just aren't big enough. And so we've got to challenge our business model and shift more towards reuse and durability and, frankly, production and consumption reduction in the longer term. And you can see here that the impacts, the greenhouse gas emissions impacts from textiles are significant. They're higher than any other kind of major material category, but per ton. And those issues are not confined to the synthetic fibers. Natural fibers have significant issues in terms of carbon emissions and other pollution and social issues as well, all of which are under the spotlight for the Commission. And in terms of what's happening with textile waste, we're seeing consumption continuing to grow rapidly in the EU, as we're seeing in actually across the world. But at the same time, we're seeing reuse actually reducing and recycling pretty much flatlining. And so we have this starting point that the vast majority of textiles at end of life are ending up either in landfill or incineration, with all of the kind of wastefulness of resources that entails, and with the emissions that entails. And where we are managing to recycle, we're generally downcycling into effectively lower grade textiles, often for single-use applications. And with reuse representing a relatively tiny part of the pie at the moment. And so I think one of the most game-changing things we're going to see coming out of the textile strategy is extended producer responsibility for textiles. This has been flagged pretty clearly in the Circular Economy Action Plan and is a tool which the Commission has been very keen to use in recent years and has done some quite radical things with. So I'm going to talk about EPR here from the point of view of the EU, which has kind of set some general rules for how EPR schemes should be introduced. And broadly, what we're talking about here is a mechanism which is intended to drive the internalization of the environmental impacts of a product into the cost of production. And it does that in two main ways. One, it makes producers directly responsible for the cost of management of the product at end of life. So that's things like recycling and creating reuse systems. And it also incentivizes eco-design, and that could be particularly important for textiles. And so basically what's happening here, and I'm showing you a scenario where there's a collective system for producer responsibility, which is the most common with existing EPR schemes in Europe. I'll come on to another approach in a moment. But broadly what's happening is that producers are paying for that cost of dealing with their products at end of life through weighted in some way in accordance with the amount of product they place on the market. One of the big innovations from the EU, though, is the idea of modulating fees. And so we will see this in the case of textiles EPR. And essentially what this is doing is taking an assessment of the environmental impacts end of life or possibly upstream as well of the product and modulating the fees to reflect the eco-design criteria of a performance of a particular product. So what that means is that if you're placing a product on the market with a higher environmental impact, you'll pay a disproportionate fee into the EPR scheme. And then, of course, you have your products going to your consumers, and at the end of their life, they're going into hopefully a recycling system or a reuse system, and ultimately going into a recycling process. And what we know from the overarching regulation on waste is that the EPR scheme for textiles will at least cover, will require producers to at least cover the cost of collection and the cost of recycling itself. And that's a significant challenge for textiles because they're complex, often very complex products that aren't easy to sort, aren't easy to recycle, and the costs associated with that will fall to producers. And then hopefully we obviously see that the products coming out of that recycling process going back into textiles, into as much as possible into closed loops. We mentioned voluntary commitments, and there are voluntary EPR schemes, but obviously what we're seeing coming out of the EU is a regulated approach. We have one kind of very well rolled out example in France already, which is described on the right of the slide here. But actually even this scheme is still delivering relatively low performance in terms of the amount of material captured for recycling or reuse, and particularly the fate of that material when it's recycled. So we're seeing, as we've talked about already, most material that's recycled being downcycled into lower grade products. Reuse substantially relying on export to low-income economies, and with very little transparency over what the fate of those products really are. So what we're expecting to see is a recycling target set within the EPR scheme, and what that would tend to mean, based on previous schemes, is that producers will be responsible for the cost of collection, separate collection of recycling, at least. Some schemes go wider than that, and also for meeting a particular recycling target. So in other words, the amount of collection for recycling or reuse that would be required to be funded will be dictated by the size of that target. And what we've seen, for instance, coming out of the plastic strategy and leading into the revisions to the packaging directive, is a move towards much more aggressive target setting. So we have a target, for instance, for plastic packaging recycling of 55%, but against a metric where we're measuring recycling when that material actually goes into a recycling process, not when it's collected, not when it's been sorted, but the amount that actually makes it into a recycling or a reuse process. And for textiles, that is likely to be there's likely to be substantial losses in existing systems before you get to the point where you'll be measuring that. So if you had something like a responsibility to deliver a 55% recycling target, as we've seen for plastic packaging, and it may well be higher than that, that will be a massive challenge for industry. But there are clear opportunities there as well. We've got the mandatory separate collection coming in, so in 4 years' time we will have rollout of separate collection of textiles across the EU, and that is undoubtedly going to drive much more focus on how we get large volumes of high quality material into the market. What we do with it at that point, of course, relies on emerging recycling and reuse technology and business models, and we're seeing a huge amount of exciting activity there as well. So there are absolutely opportunities to capitalize on these changes. Tara's going to talk more about those in a moment, but we certainly see there being competitiveness advantages right now to developing a good strategic approach to a much deeper piece of thought around what you do with your business models versus the sort of traditional sustainability reporting and evaluation processes. And certainly, again, cautioning against jumping to every certified standard for something or other, because there's certainly, as we heard from changing markets, increasing scrutiny by consumers and NGOs on those claims that are being made. So thank you very much. I think we'll probably do the same thing either with any questions in the chat. You're muted still, Ida.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your very comprehensive overview, very pedagogically laid out for all of us to understand how these extended producer responsibility schemes will work. You do have at least 4 questions in the chat, Joe. One is about the EU's mandate to set up centralized EPR schemes. Another is to clarify whether brands are expected to then pay into these schemes. Another question is about the reuse, whether you would recommend reuse targets specifically as a way to reach the goals. And also there's one about whether self-organized voluntary EPR schemes would work. Please have a look at the chat and answer directly. I think that those questions are all very, very relevant for all of us. And I think hopefully if we have time at the end, we can come back and summarize some of those answers. Without further ado, I would very much now like to introduce Tara from Flourish CSR. She's going to be exploring approaches to sustainable fashion. Tara, the floor is yours for 12 minutes.
Thanks so much. And just to check, you can see my slides in the main view. Is that something you're doing to pin the slides? Thank you. Thanks so much. So Flourish CSR is a consultancy founded just over a year ago, myself and my business partner, and our mission really is to help organisations that have got the passion but not the resource to drive their sustainability ambitions. We really believe in fashion sector transformation at pace and the power of collaboration to support that. We know the tough fashion marketplace and we know the value of sustainability and social purpose that can bring to the sector. So we support our clients with ideas and guidance to ensure that their sustainability work is sector relevant and progressive in the context of the whole CSR landscape. Looking at how fashion businesses in the sector as a whole has been approaching sustainability so far, this is quite a typical trajectory I've witnessed. The foundation always has to be understanding your own impacts, building your understanding of impacts either through a materiality assessment or some footprinting and hotspotting activities, and use of the available research, of which there's plenty. So businesses can start to address what we might call the basics without a great deal of expertise and investment, for example, starting to switch towards more sustainable materials. And typically, once businesses have made some inroads into those activities, the ones that they can immediately get their arms around, they might move towards more routes to progression through collaboration and transparency that Nusa was talking about. Beyond the fundamental activities, we can only really make progress in our sector collaboratively with supply networks, with industry fora, with our competitors. And it also makes a lot of resource sense, actually, learning from others in a pre-competitive way and getting ahead of regulation. So as sustainability programs mature, businesses tend to want to demonstrate leadership and challenge themselves to face into the most difficult aspects of sustainable transformation, where the progress really moves from incremental improvement of the business as usual model to considering new ways of doing business, new customer dynamics, and really getting into the heart of the fashion system. I don't think there's ever been a more exciting yet high risk time for fashion businesses. They're fighting for survival on the back of the pandemic, but they also know the need for transformation. But helpfully, consumer signals are starting to help brave brands and disruptors to scope what that future will look like. Once businesses have made a solid start on the things they can influence in their own business, like materials, it becomes necessary to step into this partnering and collaboration phase to tackle the things that you can't influence as a standalone business. So think systemic issues like chemical efficiency and detox or end-of-life recycling that we're talking about today are all outside of a single company's direct influence as a standalone force. So the whole network has to be engaged to really move the dial. And this is where policy will be important, but it's also where collaborative initiatives like the Zero Detox Initiative and like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, for example, really play a very important role. So if you're wanting to tackle water management in tier 3 or tier 4 of your supply chain, where chemical processing is carried out, that really needs a joined up effort. So I would cite the ZDHC as a well executed cross-sector collaboration that's helped a lot of businesses get ready for forthcoming sustainable chemistry regulations in a very structured way that engages the whole network, not just the brands. And this is where we can see businesses with more mature capability sharing what they've learned the hard way with smaller, less mature businesses, in the knowledge that that kind of radical transparency benefits sector-wide, enabling progress and scaling up the uptake of the changes that they themselves are leading. I just would like to reflect that this is a very intensive phase of the work, and it will never be done because you've got the continuous improvement that's continuously shifting. So the goalposts are always moving. And I do wonder if some businesses get stuck at this stage and quite challenged with how they really innovate towards the transformation that we all agree is needed, but they're so overwhelmed by the work they have to do to make the iterative improvements. So I think it's interesting to think about why that might be and whether some of the forthcoming policy measures will really support that transition into an accelerated phase of sustainability. So thinking about innovation and how we can see that transformation that's needed for the environmental impact we seek. Surely this is the most exciting time to be working in fashion. So just acknowledging what a torrid year most of the sectors experienced at the hands of the pandemic, it has also played a helpful role in accelerating the focus on innovation and created really the perfect conditions for a new digitised proposition to thrive. McKinsey's forecasting growth over the next 10 years of 185% growth projection for resale, whereas only a 20% growth in fast fashion, although still growing. And this is going to require new business models, new customer functionality, new brand propositions and new technology. And reuse is so important when we look at all the possible innovations because it's at the top of the waste hierarchy. So it's going to help us keep materials in use for longer and really make that significant environmental impact reduction. We can see lots of examples of disruptive entrepreneurship scaling up in this space. So business to business plug and play propositions like Swivel, for example, allowing traditional brands to access new selling models, and B2C propositions like Loopster, Thrift Plus and many others. And these are really empowering consumers. So consumers are realizing that there's value in their unworn clothes and there's attractive new purchasing opportunities in well-organized second-hand platforms with integration with social media channels, making the digital experience seamless and really reaching a new global customer. I just want to kind of highlight that there's an interesting compound effect on fast fashion here in resale because many resale platforms are only servicing higher quality product. So you've got brands with a low price quality proposition not able to access this resale market easily, and consumers are able to access more premium brands that they might not have invested in at a new price point, but can buy into it at a used price point. And they can only resell or rent out their own wardrobe if they themselves have invested in high quality pieces. So perhaps we are starting to see the value dynamics starting to shift. So we haven't got time today to tour the many types of innovation appearing, but there's an encouraging number and there's something for every type of business to get involved in. So if you're designing your products in-house, maybe you could readily adopt circular design practices to enable life cycle circularity. Or if you've got good supply chain visibility, you might be able to join up a closed loop for fibre recycling. So we can see these part loops being introduced. Getting to fully circular is probably still a North Star for most. But progress can and should be made by starting to build in circular capability wherever we can and running multiple approaches in parallel in order that they will harmonise at a future tipping point. And I think one of those tipping points will be the introduction of policy measures we've been talking about, like EPR, which will be such a leveller and will provide some of the funding that's missing for accelerating waste collection and the infrastructure that we need. Fortune does favour the brave. I think disrupting the very heart of the corporate model feels risky, particularly for the juggernauts of retail. But the time to play and experiment is now, and there's so many exciting opportunities being demonstrated in the market that it's clear that these models can and do work, and consumers have the appetite. We've often debated who will pay for the fashion revolution. And I think for the infrastructure that's needed to close the loop on fashion, it's clear that the public purse is not going to fund the cleaning up of a very dirty and profitable industry. But there is money available for innovation, for a green recovery, for scaling businesses that create new skills, employment opportunities, and increasingly support more protectionist markets, for localization of investment, perhaps. So just quickly revisiting where we started here and thinking about where innovation sits in the fashion sector. We do need to be innovating aggressively in parallel to the traditional, more iterative approach to addressing sustainability. Otherwise, brands are going to be out of business before they get to that exciting work. The good news is there's plenty of opportunity to get involved in innovation, and you don't have to have a huge R&D fund at your disposal. Investors are looking for fashion businesses evidencing their fitness for future, supporting fashion tech partnerships that will bring the next gen solutions on digital offerings or novel materials. Governments are sponsoring research partnerships with industry to make sure that R&D is commercially relevant. And through programs like Business of Fashion Textiles Technology and collaborative efforts like Textiles 2030, there's lots of support available for businesses. You don't have to do it alone. So I just want to end on a very positive note and say what exciting times for fashion. And I hope that businesses in the sector feel encouraged by the opportunity rather than feeling overwhelmed by the burden of oncoming regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. That was a very uplifting presentation, and I really appreciate the ending on a high note, because indeed, everything okay with the audio? Can you hear me? I really appreciate that you ended on a high note, because indeed fortune does favor the brave, and yet at the same time the opportunities for innovation are just tremendous. I'd like to thank all the people who are putting questions into the chat. So Tara, you had a couple of questions directly regarding your presentation. There was a question about possibly giving some examples on circular design. And I noted there was a discussion on upcycling and the value of that, and whether it should be encouraged. So please, panelists, if you could, it would be great if you could have a look at the chat as we go through to the last part of our webinar. It's already 12 o'clock. And my schedule tells me that I need to get to the last question. And so I'd like to ask all my wonderful panelists here the same question, if I may, and if you could please answer it within 2 minutes. The question is, what changes do you foresee as being necessary to reach a truly sustainable and circular fashion industry? I'd like to start with Tina, please.
Yes, thank you, Ida. So definitely what we need and what is currently lacking is a clear and comprehensive policy framework and legislation that will be able to really drive this circular transition, drive innovation, but also investments into the much needed collection, sorting, and recycling and reuse infrastructure. So these policies would include eco-design, design for circularity, meaning designing for durability, reusability, recyclability, integrating recycled materials and sustainably sourced materials, reducing toxic chemicals in the production, but also in order to facilitate recycling, for example, encouraging the use of monomaterials instead of having all these different mixes of materials that make recycling very difficult, if not impossible. Another thing would be measures to stimulate reuse and sustainable business models like resale, renting, repair. Also, efficient separate collection of textile wastes, and setting targets. So targets on recycling, reuse, recycled contents, and reducing waste generation. Of course, extended producer responsibility, and improving the traceability and transparency of the value chains by, for example, mandatory due diligence legislation on human rights and environmental issues, and also better labeling requirements, potentially digital passports, that will enable consumers to have access to more information about the environmental and social impacts of the product they buy. And also further measures on addressing the microplastics pollution, maybe setting requirements for filters inside the washing machines to capture the microplastics. And now this, of course, the EU can be the front runner, but we need global action and collaboration to really achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in particular here, SDG 12 on sustainable production and consumption. So that will be my take more on the policy side.
Thank you very much, Tina. And I think I really appreciate the list of different ideas of measures that could be introduced. But what we also know is that legislation only works if it's designed well from the start, right? So I think that again here, what we need to think about also is partnership for the goals. We need the industries, we need the NGOs, civil society organizations, and all actors to come forward and express their opinions at a time when it makes sense to express your opinions and not after the legislation is already in place. Next, Tara, please, what changes do you foresee as being absolutely necessary to reach a truly sustainable and circular fashion industry? The floor is yours.
Well, I welcome the policy measures. I welcome a level playing field for a largely, to date, unregulated sector, which businesses have called for regulation many times, and responsibly minded organisations will welcome. It will give them the competitive advantage. We've been talking about sector collaboration and deep collaboration and partnership, and just to re-emphasise really that this is not just between fashion brands and their supply chains, but it is the whole sector, much of which is not currently really actively engaged in a way that the public would recognise. So, for example, the reuse and recycling sector, and the need to support them with the development of better infrastructure to close the loop. Often just too much expectation is put on publicly visible fashion brands. They, yes, must play their part, but there is a much larger industry around them that need to be included in sector initiatives. And in particular, I'm concerned about trade barriers to circularity that need to be addressed. So to make it more viable to move waste across borders, for example, for textiles, and to direct the funding from any possible EPR schemes into supportive local and national infrastructure.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Tara. And indeed, again, once again, it's calling for wider action, making sure everybody's involved in the discussions, and looking broadly also at the flow of goods, the flow of waste, and making sure that waste can actually travel across borders to be handled correctly. Nusa, the floor is yours for the same question. What changes do you foresee as being necessary?
Yeah, thank you. I think Tina provided a very comprehensive list. What I would add is maybe it's what, Tara was saying, it's not just about fashion, it's other textile as well. So it would be good if Commission thought about that. We, for example, worked with Eunomia on a policy toolkit for the carpet sector, for EPR, for the carpets. And that, I think, is quite a significant part of textile that also should become circular. It's not right now, so we should really kind of start addressing other less sexy groups of textiles like mattresses, carpets, household textiles, and things like that. When it comes to fashion industry, I think it's really important to recognize that the driver of fast fashion is the availability of cheap polyester fibers. And this is kind of linking with the whole like production of oil and gas and nexus with the plastic being, you know, the next big like profit kind of driver for the oil industry. So I think it's really interesting to think about that from the start. And try to, let's say, address this and phase out through eco-design measures and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nusa. Yes, indeed, eco-design, designing cleverly from the beginning and making sure that all our materials can have a good story throughout their lifetime. Joe Papineschi, please, can you sum up your thoughts on what do you see as being necessary to achieve a circular and sustainable fashion industry?
Well, I think the great thing about the current situation, despite all the challenges that the textiles and fashion industries will face, is that everything the other three speakers have listed, if you look at the Circular Economy Action Plan, which I would urge everyone to do who's interested in this topic, it's a very accessible, not excessively long document, and will give you a very good cross-cutting picture of what the EU is looking to do over the next 5+ years, textiles, but also generally, and you'll get around the whole kind of sustainable production and consumption agenda, which obviously goes much wider and deeper into the economy. Everything everyone's talked about is covered somewhere in what the Commission is already looking to do. So they're clearly looking to pull all of those levers to some extent to deliver the right incentives across, not just fashion, certainly looking at the other areas of textiles that Nusa mentioned as well. I think to answer the exam question at a more strategic level, we really this is about it's the kind of perfect storm industry to understand the scale of change in consumption and, frankly, to some extent, lifestyles that is likely to be needed to deliver your truly circular textiles vision. And so that does mean material consumption reduction. There isn't any way around that. If you look at the scale of the impacts if we're thinking about net zero, we can't be producing and consuming textiles at the rate we are at the moment, anywhere near that rate, and certainly not with the number of people from middle and low income countries looking to consume like we get to in Europe. So I think in terms of what that means for industry, these kind of a focus on durability, on reuse-based business models, on resale, that feels like, from a long-term business model reform point of view, to address, effectively almost deal with those upstream impacts and the recyclability challenges at the end of life that we have with a lot of our clothing and footwear and other textile products. That feels like where we're going to need to end up, and what you've got to work out is how you remain profitable, how you grow and remain profitable in that new scenario. We're not going to be there overnight, but we are going to be there, certainly in Europe, in the next 10 to 15 years. We will see quite radical changes in the economy from that point of view. You're muted still, Ida.
I have a problem because the chat is covering my mic. Joe, please could you also comment on how small businesses are likely to be able to cope with this? There's one question in the chat on that, and I think it's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of more worried about how really big businesses will cope with it. I think it's what we're seeing, some of the greatest innovations in business models coming from SMEs. I think the challenges for the whole supply chain are really significant, and the way that I think your point, Ida, about the quality of policy making we need here is absolutely vital. There's all sorts of kind of tools which are in the roadmap already that the Commission is considering, but it's how those are implemented, how we ensure consistency, how we ensure that we effectively do this in a way which is supportive of investment and of industry taking more responsibility, that doesn't discriminate against SMEs, but also creates the right environment for this change to happen over a relatively short period of time, but in a at least reasonably manageable way. So there needs to be really clear visibility of where we're trying to get to, by when, and what kind of measures are going to be introduced over that timeline.
Good. I see. Okay, thank you so much. We have one other very interesting theme which is ongoing in the chat, and that's all about consumer behavior and how to change that, how to get consumers to think differently. I almost think this might be the subject of an entirely different webinar, and we're running out of time, so we can't take that question right now, but suffice it to say it is very, very important, and I would really very much at this time like to thank you, the 4 panelists, for sharing your insights and your perspectives on these really important angles to the textile sustainability debate. Thank you very much to the organizing teams at ADS Insight and at Eunomia. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible, and we know you're there in the background helping us with all the tech, all the visuals and all the rest. And of course, our team in India, Studio 4, thank you for the video clip. Thank you to all the participants who joined us today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I really appreciate all the comments that are coming into the chat now, and we hope that we will be able to do this again. It was a first attempt to see how the uptake would be when we get 4 advisors together to present different angles, and it looks like it went very, very well. I'm extremely pleased with today's meeting. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to the panelists. Have a great day.